Hi everyone, my name is Fai Leung from King's College London. I'm very honoured to be asked by Dr. Dana Ye to give this short presentation on a research project that I've been doing for the EC Hub lecture series. Just to give you a welfare warning for today's talk, that I will be mentioning suicides by the female character. So please do disengage if you feel you need to. A rise in anti-Asian racism since early 2020 relates closely to the racialized discourses in political media representations. Racist attacks have seen a sharp rise, especially in the global north, with women being the majority of the victims. This was highlighted in March 2021 by the Atlanta, Georgia mass shooting of 6 Asian American women out of 8 victims by a white gunman who cited the removal of temptation and sex addiction as motivation, thereby showing that this was a hate crime infused by misogyny and xenophobia. In November 2022, New Earth, the theatre group of British East and Southeast Asian artists, from now on I'll use EC as a short form, and the Chester-based production company Storyhouse withdrew their play Worth from the Sheffield Crucible Theatre. They were due to be toured there in June last year, 2023. This boycott was a result of the Crucible's decision to stage the popular musical Miss Saigon in July of that year. Now, Miss Saigon is a musical first performed in 1989 in London's Theatreland. It transposes Giacomo Puccini's opera Madama Butterfly to the Vietnam War. A couple of weeks after this boycott, I was invited as a panelist, also by Dr. Ye, to City University, entitled What's Wrong with Miss Saigon? This boycott and debate have informed my discussion of the narrative tropes involving interracial romances, white saviours, and the stereotyping of EC women. Now, they have been challenged and resisted from the EC community, as you can see here. For Miss Saigon first New York run, there were protests by the community in 1991. Now, Beats, British East Asians on Screen and Television, issued a statement about the withdrawal of Worth, explaining the main objections of Miss Saigon. And I cite, "We can never shake off the disturbing fact that Southeast and East Asian women are fetishized and hypersexualized, harassed, and even physically attacked, with the lingering trope of pliant availability, while Southeast and East Asian men are emasculated and erased." So today I'm going to talk to you about this ideology, Yellow Peril. I will track the kind of narrative arc from Madama Butterfly to its incarnations in opera, musicals, theatre, and screen media, and then mention several examples of creative activism, and in particular a theatre practice that came to the UK last year. In order to understand interracial romantic tropes, I'll first refer to the Yellow Peril ideology, which blends sexist and racist fears with a belief that the West will become outnumbered and enslaved by the East. Suspicions towards Asian men resulted in portrayals that show them as stereotypically effeminate and without sexuality, but also perverted and dangerous. You can see this late 19th century American cartoon featuring the caricature of a Chinese man with a gun in one hand, torch in another, and a knife between his teeth, straddling a hapless white woman. From the 19th century, the Asian migrants were only admitted to American society as required laborers. Anti-Asian racism can be traced back to US settler colonialism and racial capitalism. EC migrants in Britain similarly were engaged in jobs that served the white majority, as Gregory Lee detailed in his video in this series. The late 19th century US policies to restrict the entry and rights of Chinese migrants pivoted around the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, when the labor was no longer required. This act was prefaced by the much less discussed 1872 Page Act, which prevented women suspected of low morality from entering the country, the assumption behind the act being that all Chinese women were potentially sex workers. Early portrayal of women of color, especially Asian women in this case, in the American context, already characterized them as exotic, erotic, and dangerous, rendering them objects of desire to be conquered and or alien threats to be eliminated. In the 1920s and 1930s, Asian American actresses such as Anna May Wong, who was later recognized, were typically cast in the role of a dragon lady, exotic and dangerous, or these actresses couldn't find work at all. These early Asian female stereotypes, however, morphed into the lotus blossom type, subservient, innocent, and gentle, in the 1950s and 1960s, as a response to the aftermath of the Second World War and the conflicts in the East and Southeast Asian region. These stereotypes are furthermore coupled with the white saviour figure. Madama Butterfly was premiered in 1904. It sets the standard of Euro-American narratives of interracial romances, which in itself was inspired by late 19th century texts, especially the American author John Luther Long's 1898 short story, Madama Butterfly. In the opera, Cho-Cho-Sang is a 15-year-old Japanese girl who marries an American naval officer, Pinkerton, who intends to leave her to marry a proper American woman. When the officer returns to Japan, he and his American wife take Cho-Cho's child away, and she commits suicide. After the Second World War, and as the 1950s progressed, the US state became increasingly embroiled in Cold War politics and military conflicts. Filmic and popular cultural representations of Americans abroad were central in the political propaganda framework. Repeatedly, these cultural representations reiterate patriarchal customs and practices that conform to the colonial imagination of the inferiority of non-Western cultures, rationalizing the heroism of rescuing indigenous women through the agency of colonial rule. I cite Sabah Mahmood. The Vietnam War and the US humiliating military defeat became the backdrop for numerous manifestations of racialized and gendered stereotypes and problematic portrayal of interracial relationships. The women in Full Metal Jacket, Stanley Kubrick's film, inhabit polarized positionalities. They were either sex workers who promised "me love you long time" to American GIs, or they were women like the young and dangerous Viet Cong sniper, whose brutal killing by the soldiers promises remasculinization. In Kubrick's vision of the war, it turns these soldiers, who are innocent young men, into killing machines because of the Cold War and American colonialism. But they are never portrayed as being at fault. On the other hand, as Gina Marchetti says, Vietnamese women have served as disposable tokens of the cruelty of war in these Vietnam War narratives told through an American colonial lens. So, what's wrong with Miss Saigon? Opened in London's West End in 1989, Miss Saigon begins in Saigon, Ho Chi Minh City today, 1975, with a number performed by bikini-clad Asian women, the sex workers, at a bar named Dreamland. run by a man of mixed French-Vietnamese heritage known as the engineer, who is otherwise nameless. These seductive and US-obsessed natives contrast with the innocent and virginal Kim, whom will be sold to Chris. Kim and Chris develop a brief relationships, but the latter will depart, leaving Kim to give birth to the son and pine for his return. Ju Yi-chung names the musical, and I cite, a case study of the post-Cold War circulation of American neo-colonial cultural expressions and an example of Orientalist heteropatriarchal fantasies. End quote. There is no critique of Chris's abandonment of Kim, but instead his marriage to a white wife is presented as the cultural norm. Chris talks about being an American and questions, how can I fail to do good? A question that has haunted the country for its involvement in the war in Southeast Asia. The agency of the Vietnamese mother, Kim, seemingly does not count or are assumed as not as good as an American one. To that end, Kim has to be eliminated by killing herself in order for her child to become saved and properly American. Chris, by proxy America, in his attempt to protect Kim and her child Tam, will also save Vietnam metaphorically. Miss Saigon also promotes popular anti-communism and Cold War politics to the projected Euro-American audiences through the characterization of the few Vietnamese men. The engineer, as the only substantive male Vietnamese character in the narrative, personifies also these stereotypes of the suspicious and dangerous Asian man, a pimp, exploitative of his sex workers, greedy, sexual, and yet desexualized and perverse. Chris and Kim's relationship metaphorizes a global unequal transaction and the power relationship between the white man and the colonized other, replicating the conquest and corruption of the innocent American subjects in numerous other Vietnam War set narratives. Repeatedly, these cultural representations reiterate patriarchal customs and practices that conform to the colonial imagination of the inferiority of non-Western cultures. Robert Hastie and Anthony Lau, co-directors of the production of Miss Saigon for the Crucible Theatre, claimed that they would take a new approach and shift the perspective on the show. Lau and Hastie offer several changes, such as the hiring of majority easy performers, a significant number of team members as well, casting the Filipina actress Joanna Hampil as the first female performer for the role of the engineer, and shifting the US-centric perspective. The Asian-American playwright Kimberly, however, responded angrily in her own admission that Hastie and Lau's statement in fact dismissed the easy community's reaction as a matter of different personal opinions, rather than an honest expression of the damage done by racist depictions of Asian people, which she describes as a classic move by the white supremacists. Hastie and Lau's statement also suggests racism and misogyny in the source materials can be resolved, which to some extent is seen to relate to the hiring of easy creatives and performers. This assumption, despite the entrenched power hierarchy within the musical theatre industry of Anthony Lau and others' presence as almost a cure-all, also puts pressure on the easy creatives to educate and bear the burden of the historically harmful material. Kimberly subsequently comes to the conclusion that the statement is a condescending act to silence opposition and discussions of the imperialistic and misogynistic core of Miss Saigon through the reliance of non-white theatre artists to speak the truth. In particular, Lee points out, and I cite, for a non-white person in a predominantly white institution, it's not always easy to do your work, let alone speak the truth, when the structures that surround you were not built to receive that honesty as anything but an attack or whining or being difficult. The commercial value of Miss Saigon is undeniable, which might explain why this was the first time a commercially produced musical was being revived in a publicly subsidised theatre in the UK. Easy theatre performers who feel they do not have the financial luxury to refuse roles have to weigh up the economic value of doing the musical over acknowledgement of the historical harm he has done and the courage to not engage with such a problematic text. Miss Saigon is embedded in a global theatre marketplace. In fact, the Miss Saigon School in Manila, set up by the producer Cameron McIntosh, offers 6 months training in singing, dancing, and acting, producing graduates for international tours, and thus offering flexible transnational labour for the mass productions of the musical. As many of the performers for the Asian roles were Filipinos thus far, Miss Saigon and other West End musicals such as The King and I provide the country's entertainment industry's entry to a globalized performance sector, demonstrating the entrenched cultural capitalism and power inequality within a global theatre industry and how it impacts on representation. During the What's Wrong with Miss Saigon panel, one Filipino performer's statement says, and I cite, "My journey with Miss Saigon is exactly that, exploitation and fetishization of women. You believe in the American dream. To get out of the Philippines as a theatre actor, you just do what you need to do." Kimberly's own untitled Miss Saigon play toured in 2023 in the UK at the Royal Exchange Theatre, Manchester, and the Young Vic in London. It sets out to challenge long-standing stereotypes of the Asian female in previous cultural productions such as Madama Butterfly and Miss Saigon. It is a play of 2 halves. In the first, Kim, an innocent East Asian woman, is repeatedly sold by those close to her to a patronizing white American man called Clark. Clark in this story is Chris in Miss Saigon. In every setting, Kim is encouraged by her mother and the betrothed to use her innocence and youthful beauty to seduce Clark in order to get out of whatever the Asian substitute location. The colonial gendered other becomes pregnant and gives birth to the son, then waits for his return. Clark comes back with a white American wife in every version. He will take the child away in order for him to be brought up and given opportunities that Kim can never give him. Kim commits suicide in a variety of ways. These parodic episodes happen in the context of Madama Butterfly, another musical South Pacific, the Korean War to Vietnam, and in a variety of other popular stories. The first half ends in a montage of Kim killing herself again and again and in increasingly gruesome ways. The suicides of the interchangeable Kims become a ritual of by proxy killings in order to absolve the guilt of the white military men, and despite the humour of the play, engendered a sense of visceral pain in me, this audience member, through the performative reenactment of racist and gendered violence. The fact that these debates around race, gender, and the representation of Easy women in popular and media culture in the global north have persisted for decades, hence attests to how yellow peril and racist discourses are entrenched, and these discourses are made into spectacles, the selling points of narratives such as Miss Saigon. The persistent butterfly, lotus blossom, and white saviour narrative normalizes the exploitation and violence committed against the Asian body, disempowering and objectifying the Asian subject for commercial exploitation. Thank you so much for listening to this episode in the broadcast series. If you are interested to see some more challenges to Orientalism, fetishization, exoticism of women, I would encourage you to seek out this project, I Human Becoming Visible, also involving King's College, City, and Wingate Production. And you can see some of the really great videos made by students and EASY communities in the UK, available on the EASY Online Hub. Thank you.